My name is Robert Boynton. I want to welcome you to the Arthur L. Carter Institute of Journalism. This is the inaugural event hosted by the Institute's new literary reportage concentration. And we're delighted that the Paris Review, which has just published an interview with Gay Talese, conducted by our own Professor Katie Roiphe, is co-sponsoring this event, and you can buy copies of Paris Review over there, both the one with the interview and also the forthcoming issue. We're really honored that Gay Talese himself is here to talk about his work and about American journalism, because Talese really embodies everything that the literary reportage concentration is about. So it's a treat to have him here. Gay Talese is one of those rare figures who truly needs no introduction, so I'll keep this short. Born in Ocean City, New Jersey in 1932, he attended the University of Alabama and served in the military before becoming a reporter for the New York Times in 1953. His famous Esquire pieces, such as his portraits of Frank Sinatra, Joe DiMaggio, Floyd Patterson, appeared in Esquire between 1961 and 1966. The Kingdom and the Power, his Human History of the New York Times, was published in 1969. It's a best-selling book. Honor Thy Father, which has just been reprinted with an excellent new introduction by also our own Pete Hamill, was published in 1971 and also was a bestseller. Thy Neighbor's Wife, which has also been reprinted by HarperCollins with another excellent introduction by the aforementioned Katie Roiphe, was published in 1980. And Unto the Sons, Talese's book about his family's Calabrian origins, was published in 1992. And A Writer's Life, a painstakingly honest account of the process by which he wrote the book, was published in 2006. Talese has always, to my mind, been a much more exciting and complex writer than either his critics or his champions have given him credit for. And he's a writer who consistently confounds the stereotypes that have been foisted upon him. He's an Italian-American whose mother hates to cook. He spends his childhood eating in mediocre restaurants and never learns his father's native language. Despite growing up at a summer resort, he seldom swims or goes to the beach. Honor Thy Father, his book about life in the mafia, is essentially a social portrait of an intergenerational business, and hardly a shot is ever fired. I think of it as The Sopranos as channeled through Henry James. These days, discussions of journalism inevitably devolve into discussions of the business of journalism. And this makes sense, of course, because everything's falling apart, everyone's scared, no one knows what's going on. But I somehow doubt that many of the furtive schemes, business schemes that journalists over beers come up with will bear much fruit. And that wouldn't really be a problem, except for the fact that all this talk about business models has drowned out discussions we should be having about writing, reporting, research, and the great journalism that is still being produced today. My great fear is that by the time someone does discover how to fund journalism, its practitioners will have forgotten how to write. So I want to introduce the panelists. Pete Hamill, on the left, is a veteran New York journalist and novelist. He's the author of numerous books, including Downtown, Diego Rivera, and A Drinking Life. His 9 novels include Snow in August and Forever, both of which were New York Times bestsellers. His work has appeared in The Post, Daily News, Village Voice, and in addition to his many years as a columnist, he has served as the editor-in-chief of both the New York Post and the Daily News. As I was thinking about this evening, I realized that really you could tell the story pretty well of post-war American literary journalism, journalism in general, through the lives of Gay Talese and Pete Hamill. These two men have sort of worked in and met and worked with some of all the great editors and writers and been great editors and writers themselves. So we have in this room actually a very interesting historical moment. Nathaniel Rich, on the far left, is a senior editor at the Paris Review. He was the editor who worked with Professor Roiphe, on her interview with Mr. Talese. And he's the author of San Francisco Noir and The Mayor's Tongue, a first novel that was published last year. Katie Roiphe is the author of several books, including The Morning After, Sex, Fear, and Feminism, and most recently, Uncommon Arrangements. Tonight's discussion is dedicated to writing, and in particular to the works of one of journalism's exemplars. We're going to try to avoid all the trappings of the kind of academic setting, you know, this kind of thing, people give a paper, you go down the line, then people respond to the paper, that kind of thing. We're not going to do any of that. This is going to be a discussion of journalism. And it's going to be a discussion both between and among the people here and yourselves. So don't hesitate if you want to interject something. You can't say you lie, but you can say that's out of. But you can raise your hand and ask questions or blurt out questions or intervene in any way you want. That's very much the spirit that I'd like to foster today. Gay Talese is really a paradox, as I was describing before. In one sense, he couldn't be more old school with his tailored three-piece suits, his self-avowed aversion to introspection, his rigid schedule, and his association with such period-specific subjects as Frank Sinatra, the mafia, the sexual revolution. He's very much a product of his times. And yet, there's something that really keeps him from becoming a relic. And what is it? It has to do with a lot of things: his boundless curiosity, his indefatigable reporting, his obsession with the details of his characters' lives, things that I'm sure we're going to go into. And I've always believed this in being a long time a devoted reader of his, but I really saw it firsthand for the first time this last month. I was teaching a seminar in Santiago, Chile. I was invited to by my dear friend Paula Escobar, an editor at El Mercurio there. And in it, there were about 22 or 23 young women and men from all over Latin America, Colombia, Chile, Paraguay, all over. And in it, we were reading, not just Talese, but especially the days we read Talese's work, there was a kind of energy, a kind of electricity in the air that was really extraordinary. These are people who did not know much, if anything, about Frank Sinatra, Joe DiMaggio, Paris Review, things that we were reading about. And there was nothing more electric than after the session we did on Mr. Talese's work than when we really started brainstorming about ideas they wanted to write about Santiago, about life in Santiago, and they were concocting their own Talesian tales and footnoting them and connecting them to various moves and various tropes that they had noticed and really appreciated in his work. And I was thinking, if work written in way before any of these people were born, in an American publication, read sometimes in translation, sometimes not, can have this kind of power over a bunch of young people in Latin America, there's something very interesting going on. And I really want to convene this discussion to discuss that and to figure out what that is. So the question I'm going to open with is really, why in an age in which the conventional wisdom holds that young people are too busy to read, and certainly to read anything of length, does Gay Talese's work still speak to them? And in what ways can it be appropriated by them, and in what ways can it not be appropriated by them? I'm throwing that question open to whomever would like to address it.
Thanks. Okay. I thought you were going to pick on me for that one. It's a big question. I think there are many answers. I'll get the ball rolling by saying that I think the quality, first of all, this issue that we've published with this interview, I've gotten personally a more powerful response to this interview than any other interview that I can remember in the 4 years that I've been working at the magazine, and especially from younger readers. I have an intern here tonight who spent, for instance, we spent the entire interview talking about Talese, and she was not very familiar with his work before, but as soon as she read the interview, she went out and bought The Kingdom and the Power and loved it. And I also know many writers who are not just journalists in their 20s and 30s who responded extremely powerfully to this interview. And I think one main reason is that his writing has that quality that great fiction has, that shares with great fiction, which is a kind of the universal value of great storytelling. And I think when you read old journalism written 40, 50 years ago, it feels very much of its time. And with his writing, it's extremely vivid, and it feels, even though some of the subjects may be dead, the stories seem as immediate as they ever had. And I think he's one of the great storytellers that we have, and that's something that doesn't pass away with time, but I think it remains vivid.
Well, I also want to add, this isn't really about the young people, but I noticed in response, just like Nat, to the interview, a lot of my friends who are very accomplished journalists and book writers, people at the New Yorker, people working on really the highest level of their profession, said to me that their response to this interview was that they felt reproached, and they felt somehow that they were hacks, even though they were working at a very, very, again, very high level, very accomplished, very excellent writers. And what they were responding to was the level of immersion and passion that is what has made Talese's work so controversial, so difficult for some people to accept and understand, but also so alive for such a long period of time. And the idea that you would give up your whole life and go live in the West Coast with these mafia people, or you would, spend 9 years on a book and entirely adapt to the way of life of the people who you're writing about, it's something that most people aren't capable of and have never thought of. And so I think one of the things that is so seductive and so urgent and so interesting in an enduring way about this work is that human quality in it.
I think also I think the reason it has survived so freshly is that Gay writes in the classical style. It's not, gee, Mom, I'm writing. It's not some bad knockoff of Tom Wolfe, the guy who ruined more prose styles than anybody in American history. It's very clean classical writing. By that I don't mean that it's clenched or that it's trying to be translated from the Latin, although there is a bit of that in there. But keeping it clean, not having slang in it, for example. You knew a phrase was over when a politician used it. As soon as Hubert Humphrey said, I'm going to tell it like it is, that was the end of telling it like it is. Forever. And Gay never fell into that. He kept it clean, just as Hemingway never did. When you read The Sun Also Rises or something, even though it's set in the 20s, and the same with Gatsby with Fitzgerald, there's no 23 skidoo and stuff like that littering the landscape. It's clean so that you have direct access to the story. I had a great editor once who said, if you got the story, tell it. If you don't have the story, write it. And I think Gay never overwrote because he had the story. It's based on the reporting. He went there, saw the people, told you what they were like, listened to what they were saying, and chose what to print. If you look at the quotes in some of the pieces in the collections, you see that the quotes always do either one of two things and sometimes both. Reveal character and move the story. They're not sitting there. Suddenly it doesn't stop and suddenly you've got Vaughn Monroe singing a ballad. It moves the story deeper into the personality of the subject. And I think that's why it'll be relevant long after everybody in this panel is gone, because it's classical and clean.
I don't know what my role is here.
This sounds like a memorial service.
That's exactly right.
There's no corpse in the room.
I'm in a casket here, and I've got people who knew me, and they're now extolling my virtue in ways to the audience that didn't know me that well, but I'm glad to hear these people claim to know me, and I claim to know myself, and I actually don't have any great anything but admiration for example, Katie, but I wish she wasn't here because she knows me better than I know myself. And if I say anything, it'll be what she's already written or already thought and decided not to write for my benefit. And Pete, who I'm content to, I'm older, but I've loved Pete's work and I've loved Pete as a person, as a wonderful, honest person all my working life. And that's one of the great things about this profession that we come from, journalism, as a way of having admiration for the telling of the truth. Profession in which As I once said, when I looked in the city room of the New York Times, I was new to the staff then, but one day I went up to near the city editor's desk, and I looked back and I looked at all the rows and rows and rows of journalists, hundreds of them, in the New York Times building, then on West 43rd Street. And I thought, I'm 26 at the time, I'm standing in a room that per square yard has fewer liars in it than any room in New York. And I thought, this is wonderful to be among people who are less likely to lie than in the offices of the bankers, the offices of the academicians, the offices of the stockbrokers, all around the city. There are people in buildings with big rooms occupied by people, big earning people, some of them. But the fact that I was among people that I think was less likely to lie made me feel this is where I want to be. And in my work, and Pete and I have always shared this because we've known one another since we were very young. To be able to be in a profession where the only main mission is and the mandate is to tell the truth. If you can make the truth interesting, so much the better, but fundamentally it has to be, initially, as best you can produce, it has to represent the truth. It has to represent the truth, and it has to be fair. Because so often we don't know whether the truth is really fair. And sometimes the truth as we think we have it isn't really all of it. So we have to be cautious, but always fair. And if I have, in addition to the honor of being here tonight and hearing such wonderful things said about me while I'm still alive to listen to them, it is that I've had 77, and I've been working as a published person for about more than 50 years. And I never have had an occasion when someone I interviewed and published something about the interview refused to see me again. I never had that. And that is an honor I do bestow upon myself with great pride. They would refuse to see me again. And that's what I have, but I like most of all about me. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it. Shall I start all over again?
No. We'll reconstruct it.
I hope you heard.
I want to pick up on something Katie said, which is that in reading this interview, some of the writers she's talking about, and I can imagine who they are, felt they were quote-unquote hacks. And maybe unpack that a bit. I mean, I'm assuming that they're responding to the kind of the extraordinary reporting, the level of commitment that you described. And that really is at the heart of what Mr. Talese's writing is about, and also about what this literary reportage program is about. It is about very self-conscious about reporting. And he wrote one of a really terrific essay in 1987 about his piece, Frank Sinatra, called "When Frank Sinatra Had a Cold," and it's a really terrific piece, sort of the story of the story, and it's very enlightening for anyone who's a fan of that piece and his work. But it's very chilling towards the end, and he's talking about the economic realities and how much money it took to keep him in hotels in L.A. while Frank Sinatra continued not to talk to him, and all the research he did. And he talks about how expensive it's become. And he says, the last two lines are, the road has become too expensive, the writer is at home. And the reality, as we all know, anyone who's done a lot of reporting for these magazines, is that it is harder and harder to go out and do extensive travel and take a long time with pieces. There are a few places like the New Yorker and other places that support that, but very few. What is it? How are the people who you're talking about who felt like hacks dealing with that?
Well, see, I think that they weren't responding to necessarily the economic reality, which you write about, and the luxury to write about things in depth. And most of them are still lucky enough to have that expense account and that luxury. I think more they're responding to this sort of tepid professionalism in themselves, which is something that we learn, say, here at NYU often about reporting, which is that there's supposed to be a distinction. There's the subject who you interview, and there's you, and it's not a friendship, it's not a love affair, it's not an intimacy that you throw yourself into. And so there is a kind of professionalism, a cool professionalism that most journalists and historians and cultural writers go about their business with that in mind. And I think what's so interesting about Gay's work is, and so controversial and has caused billions of critics and kind of reviewers to be outraged and enraged by his work, is that he does cross that barrier. And often, people will say in his negative reviews, how did he know what this person was thinking? He's making it all up. And I think this is something Gay has said has haunted him since he was early on in his career when he was writing, his first pieces for the New York Times. The other reporters would think, how does he know what these people are thinking? And the reason he knows what these people were thinking is because they told him. And most people aren't going to talk about things that, say, for instance, in My Neighbor's Wife, these kind of secret sexual things. Most people are not going to talk to a reporter about this, but they are going to talk to Gay. And it's that quality of total immersion in his subject and of a sort of human element where he actually lives his books in a way that I don't know anyone else. I can't think of a single writer on earth living their books in that particular way. So I think that's the reproach there that I was referring to. And that's, would make, I think, all of us feel like hacks because we go to our day's work and we go home after our day's work and we're tired and we have dinner, we have a glass of wine and we're done with it. And Gay's subjects, he says, they haven't objected and they haven't issued corrections, but he stays in touch with them for decades sometimes after he's finished with a story, and that's also unusual because the book has a life of its own in his mind. It keeps going, and most people, they're done, they have the deadline, and they're moving on to something else.
Sorry. Well, I also was going to say that there's also technical things that he does as a reporter that I think are fascinating and go against what one thinks of as the roles that a journalist should play. For instance, in that piece that Robert quoted from, he talks about not using a tape recorder. In fact, he talks about not even taking notes in front of the person that he's interviewing, and furtively, when the person goes to the bathroom, scribbling down details and remembering things. And I would be interested to know more details about the craft of reporting that you do to create this atmosphere where the person is so comfortable that they'll tell you things that they maybe will not want to tell other reporters.
Well, as some of you know, and certainly as Katie Royke does know in excess, as my life began, not in a home where there was great respect for literature. There was no literature. My father, as some of you know, who've read a little bit about me, was a tailor. Was a tailor all his life. And my mother had this dress shop that Robert referred to. And as a boy growing up, I thought I had half a life. And I think that was pretty good, to have half a life if you thought about being a writer, either a nonfiction writer or a fiction writer, where you could make it up. I never thought of making it up because I had this half a life, this fractured life, the son of a foreigner at a time in World War II when being Italian wasn't very socially acceptable because the Italians were in the war with Nazi Germany, as you know, allies, and the town in which I was born and reared was a town of Protestants, and the Italians were a minority within the church, which was a minority dominated by the Irish, not the kind, lovely Pete Hamill kind of Irish. Some of them were a little bit hard on
Brooklyn Irish.
Yeah, the elevated kind. These were the South Jersey Irish. In any case, but where my curiosity began was overhearing some of the comments made by my mother's customers, who were women, in her dress shop. And the stories they would tell were not newsworthy stories. They were maybe just the material that fine fiction writers could turn into stories, demanding the imagination of a fiction writer. The stories were simple stories of ordinary people in an ordinary town in an extraordinary time, World War II. And the women, middle-aged, most of them, large sizes and dresses, would pause in the leisurely atmosphere of this dress shop on the main street of a small town in the 1940s, maybe talking about rationing of food or the lack of rationing, or the lack of gas, the lack of things, in addition to the concerns of people during that time about relatives in the military or the late night of those who worked in defense plants. All of these stories about on the margin of the war front as expressed by women in a dress shop in the wintertime in a summer resort. When after school I would help out my mother at age 11, age 12, dusting the counters and folding the cardboard boxes that were used when she sold a dress, tissue paper, packing the dress in the cardboard box that I had folded. And I would listen to these stories. And they were stories that I hadn't any other way of knowing about, because the people who were my mother's customers were not part of the little sense of social life I had. We lived above the store. In the daytime, my father, the tailor, and my mother, the entrepreneurial woman who sold dresses, and the conversation she had, she spoke English very, very well. My father spoke with an accent and didn't speak very much at all to anyone except those few men who had him make suits for them. Few, because very few men would pay enough money for him to craft these suits, which took him a long time. He was a fine tailor, but made no money, and unfortunately his role during this time was to alter the dresses my mother sold. So he wasn't even practicing the craft of being a tailor. And as I said, because it was a wartime period, and his brothers were in the Mussolini army defending Italy against the Allies that were invading at that time in 1942-43, he didn't want to say very much, because his personality was one, in a way like me, but excessively so, of having a split personality. In the daytime, appearing as a patriotic American with the customers that he met, those few he did meet through his tailoring, but he was more in the back room. My mother was the woman in the front, sometimes having a high school girl help her out during the summer months. But these women that were my mother's customers, and later on her friends, were the source of information that I first got about my town in this time when I was an impressionable person of 12 or 13 or 10, whatever, those 4 years of the war. I didn't do a great deal of reading when I was of this age. When I was in high school, I did some reading, and it was fiction. And the fiction that I read was soft porno, I guess you would call it. It wasn't really porno, because you couldn't get porno at that time. I would have gotten it if you could, but you couldn't get it. But there was a writer that I just loved, and his name was Frank Yerby. And he wrote racy novels, but they were very, very romantic, at least I thought they were, and very sexual, I thought they were too, by the standards of that time and by the limitation I had of what was defined as sexual. But they usually were made up of women who dressed very excessively in their gowns, and there was a period, they were really 19th century women, some of them in the Deep South. This writer, incidentally, Frank Yerby, I think he was born in New Orleans, a black man who spent most of his writing life in Spain. And there was nothing in his writing that would indicate that he was a black man. He must have learned a lot of his style as a writer from the bold French writers of the 18th or 17th century, I'm guessing. But I liked his work a lot, and it was storytelling. The women in his novels were not all like the women I saw in the store, although sometimes in the store I would be interested in what it is like when my mother took women into the dressing room and they tried on dresses. Occasionally the door would be open, and I was never necessarily a voyeur, but I did get a sense that women with their clothes off were rather interesting. It wasn't with their clothes off, but they would be. And but the impression of the store was interesting because it brought me into the era of good manners. I think that journalists, I think that everyone, but particularly journalists, I think should have good manners, because you're dealing with strangers initially, and you're trying to, at least in the beginning, get your foot in the door. And if your behavior, your appearance, all of this that matters to people who own stores, if you're store bred as I was, you pick up things that later on are very useful to the work of a journalist. And the curiosity, of course, which is essential. I feel embarrassed talking in front of Pete Hamill about this stuff. He knows probably better than I do. But forgive me, Pete, for this time I'm taking of yours. But But the interesting thing for me was that I had this half-life, I told you, waiting to be filled. But it was a life that in the evening when we moved up to the second floor, this kind of duplex mentality I had. In the evening, it was an entirely different world. I would hear my father, who said very little during the day, speak at great length in the evening when there was no one except my mother and me, his only eavesdropping son, and my younger sister there, and we weren't paying that much attention, he thought, but I was. He'd be talking during the evening, fearing not that his words would be overheard by customers, about his concerns, his fears, mostly his worrying about his brothers being killed. Soldiers, 3 of them were soldiers then. 2 of them would end up prisoners of war and never quite be the same after they got out, but that's getting ahead. I just want to dwell on the fact that there's one building with the stores on the first floor and the apartment on the second floor. I saw different attitudes of people during the day. There's 2 characters. My parents in the day were not the parents at night, so I had 2 sets of personalities revealed to me in this period of the war, and how, though we were far, far removed from any kind of conflict except personally and interiorly, but the war was played out in the voices of the women who were the customers in a way. Their husbands were maybe at the front, or their son or their daughter was a whack, and all this you heard about, and the rationing and the concerns and the deprivation and the patriotism, of course. And the patriotism that was expressed through that period was well beyond 9/11. I mean, the patriotism was constant, shared by all. The town had flags of the American flags, not only over the main street, but throughout the community. Since we're on the ocean, the lights that faced the ocean were painted black. Automobiles, the lights were half painted black. You weren't supposed to excessively use the lights. There was a sense of deprivation, a sense of salvation, a sense of frugality. And in my own home, there was this sense of being on the wrong side of the war. And I overheard this. And I never thought this is a story. But what I did feel then was there are stories in any place you happen to be. And there are stories that anybody could represent if you have the interest in other people. And if you're new to America, as I was in a sense of being the son of a foreigner, and as I was also as a very insecure young man, because I didn't have around me anybody I could confide in except my parents, and I wasn't sure to what degree my complaining to them would resonate in any kind of understanding on their part, because they had a lot more to worry about than I did. But I did have a sense of intense curiosity and an awareness that in a small space you can find a lot of stuff, a lot of stories in that 2-story building. I did, because one of the customers who could afford suits made by my father happened to be the editor of the Town Weekly, Lauren Angevine by name, and a regal figure in my life, and that he offered to give me opportunity to write about the high school students in a column called High School News for the weekly paper, which I did when I was a junior in high school. I was 16, I started doing that. I did till I was 17. And then I didn't write necessarily well. I certainly didn't write as well as Frank Yerby. But I did, at least through the experience of being a journalist and being able to indulge my curiosity, which journalism gives you the passport to do that. You are shy, and you have, even if you don't have a press card, which I of course didn't have, but you have the right to ask questions. It isn't just being nosy. You have a right. I was working for the Ocean City Sentinel-Ledger, and I had a column called High School News. So I had an opportunity to know a little bit more than I otherwise would have about these students that were my classmates in fact, but in real fact, I didn't know very much about them, except through the interview I got to know something about them. So this is a pattern. I don't want to dwell excessively. I already have, perhaps. But when I went to college, it was again being a foreigner, because I was My grades were not good. What I was good at was being curious. And that was not part of the curriculum in high school. You didn't have a class, oh, you're good in curiosity, A+. So I had nothing going for me that measured up in terms of at least grades. And, but my second big break was, again, a customer of my father, who happened to be the doctor in the town, whose suits were made by my father. And when I was unable to get into a college, you read this, please forgive me again, Katie, for going over this material, yet again with you. But having this doctor who, when I couldn't get into a college, said, send Gay to Alabama, was the best thing that ever happened to me. The doctor got me in Alabama because he's from Alabama. He was a Birmingham-born physician in this town of Ocean City. And in 1949, when I was 17, graduated from high school just barely, I got a chance to go to college. My father wanted me to go to college, and of course he didn't go. It was true of my generation. I don't know, but I think it's true of Pete Hamill. But we who became journalists in the 1950s, I started in 1955, but 2 years after I graduated from Alabama was 1953. But 49 when I went to college, and when I became a journalist, a real journalist, in the 1950s, most of my colleagues, even on the New York Times, you would think, but most of them were, as myself, people on the staff who didn't have parents who went to college. We were definitely the underclass. I think it helped us too. I was underclass no matter where I was. And when I went to Alabama as a student in 1953, it was another thing of trying to get, realizing I had half a life and I wanted to know what was the other half that I could find out from the people who were sharing space with me, sometimes as classmates, sometimes as people that I got to write about. And when I was at Alabama, I wrote about students, as I did at high school, and I also wrote about the athletes, because I was able to get a job on the college newspaper. After my second year, I got a job as a sports writer. I was the sports editor, excuse me, of the college newspaper, and then I got to know athletes, and I had a chance to be with them between games and interviewing them during the week of a football season, and basketball and football. I mean, mostly football down in Alabama, as you might imagine. So I got to know something of the life of the athlete, and these were very accomplished people. To get a scholarship at a big university, a sports scholarship, was an accomplishment for these people. And it was an accomplishment for me to get to know people I otherwise would not have known. Got out of there and came to New York in 1953. I was a copy boy, but all that training of being a product of a store, having store manners, being the son of a tailor, I was always well dressed, because it was one of the things he insisted that I not embarrass him, and I never have. It was also cheap to get suits from him, because didn't cost me anything. And but also I believe I don't think this is important to other people, but I also believe that it helped made a good impression on strangers. So the good manners, the appearance, somehow for me, it helped get the door open. And then after you had the door open, you got to know people, and they talked to you, and you talked to you, and they talked to you again, because you had patience. You had to have patience. The curiosity kept you so far. And then the patience to hang around. The art of hanging around is the phrase I've often used in later years, beyond what I'm talking about at this period. But hanging around and having the patience to let people at their own pace reveal themselves. And when they do, not to take advantage of the fact that they're trusting you. Always bear in mind that even though they may have said something, they may not have meant it. Be careful with the quotes. You might get people off guard, and they'll say things, and they really have said word for word if you got it down right. But it doesn't mean that that's what they mean. So you have to know your people, so they could be quoted out of context by themselves. People have quoted out of context. People sometimes quote themselves out of context. And I was always aware of that. So you have to what you do if you're lucky enough to penetrate the privacy of people and to get to know them so you can finally, with certitude, know how they think, so you can write, he thinks such as, she thinks such as. If you get that far in the relationship, and it is a relationship, it is a partnership. Prose writing is wonderful alone, but it is a partnership before you get to the point of being able to write intimately about people. You are working with people. You're not a co-author, but you are working in a kind of relationship. And it should not be betrayed because the quote is fascinatingly striking, attention-getting, or because the information would be shocking and therefore attention-getting and maybe commercially viable. But that's taking advantage of people. It doesn't mean that I've ever written for permission. I've never been a collaborator with people. I've never written an as told to. And I've never, me or Hamill and Wolfe and Breslin, all Halberstam, all of our generation and the generation today, we would never submit our work to the person we're writing about. The editor is the first person to see what we're writing about. And the person we're writing about has no control of what we say. But there has to be, I believe, fairness to people. Fairness to people. And that's all I have to say about that, I guess. Said too much, maybe.
No, let me interrupt. One of the things that my students, when we read your pieces and read them as a piece of a work by a potential colleague to appropriate from, to steal from, they say, I can never get that kind of access. People won't talk to me that long. And one of the ways that it seems that you've been able to do that is, with certain obvious exceptions, you've written about people who are not quote-unquote important. You've written about a lot of ordinary people. How much of that do you think is a key to getting you the kind of time and attention that you need?
Well, I think, let's begin. I think whatever I think of myself, and I am a modest person. I don't think I'm so great. But what I think I have and what others have, and Hamill has, and Halberstam had, and Wolfe and the rest, I think in my case, I know that what I'm doing, I believe that what I'm doing is important. I believe that nonfiction is important, if done well. I believe that journalism is important.
Can you explain when you say important?
Well, I believe that, okay, I believe, first of all, when I stood and looked at the city room, and Hamill could have done the same thing at the Post or the News or Katie, anybody, who, even if you write fiction, as Pete does, and Tom Wolfe writes fiction, Katie, but I think that as a nonfiction writer, particularly if you start as I did, and others, Pete and others, started in a newsroom, I thought these people, first of all, are in an honorable profession. So I had pride in the profession. Pride in the profession because, as I said, there were relatively few liars. And if they did lie, and some of them do, there's no cover-up in journalism. If you're a Jason Blair or if you're a whoever you are, your colleagues are going to turn on you. And that is another manifestation of what this honor in this profession is. There's an honor code. There's a code of honor. And if you violate it, you're out. And I like that. So it's important, and it's honorable, and it professes to be as honest as people who can be with other people that you don't know very well, your sources. Excuse me, Kay, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Please do.
No, I was going to say, I think that actually, though, that Gay has a personal quality that makes him different from your run-of-the-mill interviewer. And I just give him as an example, I remember the first night I went out to dinner with him, and I'm certain that I told him all my deepest secrets within 15 minutes. And I know that this is true, and I think that the reason is that he is more interested, actually authentically interested in other people than nearly anyone under the sun. And I think that what he was talking about as curiosity is actually, I think I said this in my introduction, most of us can't muster that kind of curiosity that he has for an absolute stranger building a bridge for our closest relatives and family members and best friends. And so how interested he is in that story is going to elicit the story from anybody. And it's, I don't know what to call it. It's a combination of charm and intensity. It's a very particular thing, but I think it's a specific quality that enters into the Talese writing. I also noticed in his long discussion of the store that he referred to the house. He was talking about the house and the store, and he said, well, there were these two characters. And these two characters were his parents. And most of us, journalists, newspaper writers, we don't think of our parents as characters. And that was a very revealing moment in that answer because, yes, Philip Roth, we imagine, thinks of his parents as characters. Yes, a novelist thinks of their parents as characters. But we don't think of a nonfiction writer thinking and expressing themselves sort of unconsciously, I assume, in that way. And so I think it is, what I would call the novelist's heart that raises his interviewing and his relationship with his subjects, as complicated and controversial as it is, to a whole different level.
Yeah, I think it's empathy, and I think that's something that any good novelist has to have is to be able to imagine oneself as another person, just as any reader must have when reading a novel. And I think one of his geniuses is to carry that into nonfiction. And oftentimes, I think when you think of a hard-charging journalist, you don't think of that person as particularly empathetic to his subjects always. He's trying to get an interview, he's trying to get a quote, trying to get something from the other person. It's more predatory. And I think this kind of empathetic approach comes out of fiction in some way, and that's what separates him. I think maybe that's just another word for describing what Katie was talking about.
Or it keeps his negative capability in a way, that your ability to go outside of yourself, it could be poetry, it could be fiction, is what allows you to imagine someone else's life.
Well, I think that there is, since there's so many people who are students here, I would like to try to keep in mind what I'm saying that might relate to the classical work or to the young careers that we have in this room. I think, unlike Pete and myself, who are of the underclass by birth, and brought to journalism our sense of being the outsider, which so characterized the reporting of most people I knew and respected in the 1950s and 60s. I think one of the, I'm not saying it's a problem, and I hate to use the word challenge. I hate that word. Challenged by something. Oh, we're so challenged, she said. But there is something about class that is worth addressing to anyone who's interested in dealing with writers of with writing, the nonfiction writing that we're talking about. I think that in as much as Americans of your generation are so much better educated in a formal way than those that when I was your age, I think that it must be, you must be reminded of how important it is to deal with the underclass and to have patience with people that are not very interesting in the beginning. People with whom your vocabulary is not going to be fully expressed to their benefit. I'm merely saying there are times when there are times when you really find stories in the hearts of people who are not able to give you access to themselves because they don't know how to express themselves properly. And more important, I think, there is the demand of the serious writer of nonfiction, the curious, serious writer of nonfiction, to deal with people spend lots of time, excessive amounts, long amounts of time with people that are simply in the beginning not very interesting. And if one is going to spend most of one's working time with people that aren't very interesting, you have to really be interested and indulging your curiosity and seeing if your length of time with these people is really going to produce writing worth reading. Now, I don't want to embarrass my dear wife who's with us tonight, but I want to share. Another word I hate is sharing, but
It's a challenge, Sharon.
challenge
isn't
sharing. But my illustrious figure, Nan Talese, editor premier, is a woman who spends her time with intelligent people. She gets up in the morning and walks through the office filled with intelligent people. Big rooms filled with some liars in there, but we don't care about that. She deals with editors, she deals with agents, and she deals with writers. All of them, or most all of them, are intelligent. Even Pat Conroy's intelligent. Margaret Atwood we know is intelligent, and Ian McEwan we know how intelligent he is. And all these intelligent people. And sometimes after she spends her day with intelligent people editing manuscripts with intelligence, she comes home, and I start talking at dinner. We have dinner together, and we most often do, talking about what she did that day and what I did that day. Good husband-wife, typical dinner conversation. And I realize that she's always with a kind of higher class, at least in the intellectual sense, than I am, or more often than not she is. Now, we have friends in common. Some of the writers are friends in common. But I realize my wife would never make it in my world. She would never make it as a journalist. She would never make it as a nonfiction writer, because she would only be writing about intelligent people, because there's people that you can go to the Century Club with and have dinner with. And so I don't believe, this isn't a criticism, mind you. It is trying to make an example of someone who happens to be here unable to defend herself. But if we're talking about class, and I don't think that writers are of any class. The aforementioned Philip Roth, who is about my age. I think he's about 77 or 76 at least. But he is, and I think in fiction, Pete Hamill wouldn't have a problem, because some of the wonderful writing that Pete does, which is inspired by his own life and his own family, he is a man who knows all the classes. He's attended all the classes. He's part of all the classes, which a great writer is always. I think Hemingway, or Pete will correct me, but I think Hemingway said, or I don't even paraphrase him, but something about the importance of a writer having among his friends people of different classes. Did he say something like that?
I don't remember.
Well, then I made it up. But knowing
certainly true.
It is true. And it's also true that I've lost my point. What is the point? What was the point?
About the importance of being able to talk to people who aren't necessarily of your class or are interesting at first blush.
That's right. I mean, there are people. Well, the Uncommon Arrangement people were all intelligent. You chose to write about in your last splendid book. But you deal with people that, I mean, I know you lived in a high-rent section of Brooklyn, but you deal with different classes of people, don't you, Katie? You do. I'm glad to hear that. She's a very educated mother and was a writer, I guess you know. But anyway,
Could I ask
go
a
ahead.
question going back a bit? Both of us grew up before television. Do you think that made us better listeners, more tuned in to the stories being told by humans and not professionals? Do you think there was something connected to that? Because even the Frank Yerby stuff has its parallel. Erwin Shaw told me his favorite writer was Dumas or Raphael Sabatini, who wrote Scaramouche. Mm-hmm. My first book I ever finished was Bamba the Jungle Boy at the Giant Cataract. They were as far from books about Brooklyn, because Irwin's from Brooklyn too, you could possibly get. Although later, when I went to interview Mike Tyson in jail in Indianapolis, I asked him what he was doing. He says, I'm reading the Count of Monte Cristo. He says, man, that Edmond Dante's in the Chateau d'If. He started to talk about it. But you knew that novel about a guy unjustly accused had tapped, that Tyson in jail had tapped into it. that it was speaking still to him, all the way from the 19th century to Indianapolis to Mike Tyson. And I wonder whether our good fortune and timing was that we didn't end up with our fictions carrying soundtracks, laugh tracks,
Yeah,
all
well,
the other crap
that may
that
be
goes with
true.
television.
But it's also, I think, true, and I think you'll agree with me, that radio, which we did listen to, it was sometimes very visual.
Yes.
Even I've heard of sports, some of the times the baseball games on the radio, you could actually had a sense of being there if the
Yes.
announcer was doing a good job of description.
But you had to be active and decode those words and make the pictures.
Yes,
Where you
and there was
didn't have to
even
do
one
the
announcer, Gordon McClendon was it? It wasn't even at the game, and he described the game he wasn't at. Do you remember that radio series?
television. Ward Wilson.
No,
Marty
Gordon
Glickman.
McClendon. He made up the games. Willie Morris, in his book North Toward Home, I think it is, makes mention of listening to the radio in Mississippi to this man who he would get baseball games coming over the Western Union ticker. And it all was what the score was, inning by end, who pitched and who was batting, and did the person strike out or ground out or do this. And then this guy would read the ticker and then he'd make up the game. That was fiction, but no, it wasn't. It was like
Recreate.
the worst of new journalism, wasn't it? But what I did after I got beyond Frank Yerby, I did get to read good writers, and I started in college when I had access to the library. Got the New Yorker. I never subscribed to the New Yorker. I never even saw the New Yorker. But I did start reading New Yorker writers. And I read the fiction you mentioned. Irwin Shaw, who was as you know, one of my very favorite writers. And John O'Hara is one of my favorite writers for the dialogue writing. And of course, John Cheever, who really described married life. Oh, wow. He was just wonderful. And even the nonfiction writers I would read, not with the enthusiasm of fiction writers, but I'd read, of course, Liebling and Joe Mitchell and St. Clair McKelway, and much later the writers that are contemporaries of ours. But the New Yorker set the standard, I thought, and I'd read better fiction, and I even read some of the. Well, you mentioned Brooklyn. I mean, one of the wonderful stories about Brooklyn. I remember a story called "Only the Dead Know Brooklyn" by Thomas Wolfe. I think that's out of a novel, but I remember when I read that as an excerpt, I really thought I knew a lot about Brooklyn, and here was a man from North Carolina who really caught the flavor of a man jumping out of a building, and his blood and body was splattered along the sidewalk.
Let me interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Ask you about a paradox of something you're saying. You're talking about a generation of writers who don't have, or uncredentialed, both in class terms and ethnic terms and other ways. And yet, one of the things that I use your work to teach my students the most is how a writer has to take possession of a story, take possession of the characters. Certainly have empathy in reporting them, but when you set them on the page, they are your characters. You use their words, you don't falsify their lives, but they dance to your tune in the terms of the way you're going to represent
Well,
them.
you have a voice. There's a writer's voice that all of us have different voices. Hamill has a voice. The Tom Wolfe certainly, and Hemingway, and all these writers have been John Cheever. Everyone has a voice, and that voice is what you don't distort the person with your voice, but with your voice you understand the person and put it in your terms. And so that voice is something that we just don't automatically repeat ourselves with that voice with each story we write. Each time you begin writing a different story, or at least a story about different people, you have to work again to discover your own voice. The first sentence, the second sentence, the first paragraph, the second paragraph is never what you want. So I rewrite first sentence many, many times till I can hear the voice. Obviously, the kind of work we're talking about up here is not work ideally realized on deadline conditions, especially daily deadline conditions. So when I was working for a daily paper, and I'll let Pete address this himself after I merely say that it was hard for me to make a deadline. What I did do, and Katie quoted me in her excellent interview, and parenthetically, that interview couldn't have been done if the person doing the interview was not and is clearly a wonderful writer. That interview is really not an interview. It is an understanding of a person, but it's in Katie. I mean, I just think that but let's not boast about Katie anymore. She has enough in this. Oh, she's a big professor here. I know that. But the voice is important. But the voice is the writing is never easy, and I don't think it should be.
But one of the ways that you accomplish voice, and it's something that I only really realized after the first time I interviewed you a number of years ago, and you were talking about this epic story that you chronicle in A Writer's Life about trying to write about this young Chinese girl who's a soccer player, and spent a lot of time in China, a lot of time reporting, and I asked you about translators and things like that, and you said, what people say really isn't that important. It's watching them do things. And I just thought that was the oddest thing for the longest time. And then as I teach your stuff pretty consistently, I went back and I was looking at something like Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. There are very few quotes in that. The voice comes through partly because it is you, and you work quotes in here, there, here and there, but I feel like a lot of young writers oftentimes are scared and use too many quotes because they want to somehow back out of the piece of writing and put forward the people they're writing about in a way that sort of inoculates them or something like that. They don't want to take control of the characters somehow, that master them.
Well, I think that paraphrasing what a person says, if you can, maybe you can achieve more in terms of meaning by not quoting, by paraphrasing. If you really understand what they're saying, and I know that one of the magazine pieces that I did use a lot of quotations is the one on Floyd Patterson called The Loser. And the reason I did quote him verbatim a lot, is I spent so much time with him. But when I did hear him say something and I'd write it down, sometimes I do, as was said, take notes when the person isn't there. But in the case of a person that I have established a long-term relationship with, such as the fighter who was, when I was young, the heavyweight champion, Floyd Patterson, I'd done about 30 different interviews with him over a course of about 4 or 5 years for the New York Times or other magazines, not Esquire, but a few other magazines I also wrote for. And in 1962, I think it was, when I wrote this piece for Esquire, he was at his camp, and I went up there, 4 or 5 days in a row and interviewed him, and I'd make notes in front of him. And then he would say something, and I'd write it down. And I'd say, wait a minute, do you really mean, this isn't what I know you said long ago. Well, maybe this. Then I was actually taking notes with him leaning over the pad I was using, and I was getting him to refine his language, but not out of a way that he would lose his voice. I wasn't taking his words and making them mine. I was just going over, like I do in my writing, again and again, and I wanted to fashion as much as I could while being true to his words, using his language, not mine. But I wanted to get it not only to be accurate, but fully accurate. Tape recorders, which I've avoided, are difficult because people do not speak in sentences, and sometimes if you do quote exactly what people say, it doesn't make any sense, or it not very readable. I think paraphrasing is good, but there are exceptions, such as this Patterson one. I did have a lot of confidence that my writing in front of the person wouldn't disturb them. People you don't know very well, or at least the early stages of an interview, then it would be intrusive to write notes in front of people, I think. But I want to stay on whatever question we have.
Well, I'd like to turn to the sort of the the theme, one of the themes of this evening is really the relevance of your work to younger journalists, to young journalists starting out. I mean, let me play devil's advocate. I can imagine someone in this audience or on the podcast or whatever listening to this and saying, well, that's great, I'm glad that in his time he could have beautiful suits made for his father by his father and take, meet with Floyd Patterson 40 times and spend all this time doing these sorts of interviews and, go out and live in sandstone and have these experiences. What the hell does that have to do with me? I want to be a Gay Talese type. I want to write and report at that level, that kind of level of excellence and dedication. How do I appropriate that? Is this relevant to me at all? Nathaniel, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit about, for younger people encountering this kind of work, not just as reading it as, this is a journalistic masterpiece, but something I want to appropriate from. Is that possible now? In this day and age?
I think it's important first to keep in mind that some of these pieces that he was writing for Esquire, he was writing at a certain stage in his career. He had been at the Times for 10 years. And as he was just saying, he had the occasion to interview Patterson, for instance, many years. And I think a great story is the story of his first piece about that he talks about in the interview, about the man in the Times Square building who's responsible for putting the headlines up on the scroll that goes around the building. And that's a piece that anybody could conceivably do. It didn't require the same amount of legwork, and it didn't require any money. It required purely curiosity, and maybe a little stealth maneuvering to get up the stairs and past whatever bodyguard might have been there.
Today, that guy has a press agent who would have to go through and.
But then this, and then it was just a matter of getting to know this person and getting his confidence. And I think someone maybe 15 years along in their career might be able to do today, under certain conditions, a piece like the Patterson. But it was a process, I think, for him to get to that stage.
Well, walking through the streets of the city, which we all do every day, presents itself with opportunities for so many stories that are there. I was recently walking on 9th Avenue and 9th Avenue and 42nd Street. Actually, when was this? July, I guess it was. I remember I was walking to do this piece I did on the Circle Line cruiser for the Times. They gave me an assignment. And I was walking to Pier 83 on 12th Avenue and 43rd Street, where the Circle Line headquarters is. And on my way, I saw a man. There was a construction site. There was a construction job of repairing the sidewalk, repairing the street, actually, on 9th Avenue and 43rd Street, or 42nd, I think it was 43rd Street. I'm walking west toward the pier for the Circle Line interview. And I saw a man, a working man, with earth-moving equipment. He was in a Caterpillar. He was maneuvering this thing. And he was, with the fork in front of it, or that great hand, that great iron claw, he was lifting rock in this job on the sidewalk, or in the sidewalk and curb, rock, and dumping it into a truck. And then he would move that claw out of the truck's rear dumping area, what do you call it? Dumping stuff in the truck, and they'd move that claw around, and he'd turn the thing around. He was in this vehicle on tracks, and he'd scoop up more dirt or rock or cement, whatever, and turn around and do it. And then he would move that vehicle, shifting into various gears, around, turning it around. There was traffic, very trafficked area. He wasn't hitting any cars. Sometimes people would be told by his partner, stay away, stay away. But what impressed me is how skilled this man was in what he did. How sure he was of the gears. How sure he was of every movement of that vehicle, that odd-looking vehicle. And he was up there, and he was taking great pride, it seemed to me, in what he was doing. And I stopped to watch him. And I stopped, and the lights changed, and I didn't go to the circle, I just stayed there. This guy, I told myself, knows what the hell he's doing. He knows his job. How did he get to be so so skilled? How did he maneuver? I mean, sometimes it's hard for people to just drive a car that has gears. I mean, the gear shifted. Here, there's so many gears I could see. I've never been in one of those contraptions, but I was all these gears, and he was moving things up and down, and he's turning things around and going back and forth. And he was so sure of what that vehicle could do because he was so sure and had been trained. He was a youngish man, and finally there was a pause, and he stopped, and I went over to him. I said, "Listen, I just watch what you do, and I just think you're really, really good." And he smiled, and he says, "Could I talk to you sometime?" And I could barely bear it. So much noise in the street. I yelled, "Can I talk to you?" He said, "Who are you?" "I'm a writer, but I would like to do a story sometime on you." He looked at me, and he said, "What's your name?" And I gave him, if I said Ernest Hemingway, he wouldn't have cared. But I said, "Look, you can check me out." I said, "Here's my name. And just go to the website. You have somebody has a website. Go to somebody that has a. Check this out. Check me out. And then here's my phone number. And call me up." And that night, I got a phone call from this guy, Hispanic, Hector Lopez or something like that. He said, "I checked you out." And I said, "Well, will I be able to talk to you sometime?" He said, "Sure." I said, "Well, listen, I have some articles I have to do, and I have some, but will you be around this next year?" He says, "Yes, I'm be around. I'm not going anywhere." He gave me his phone number, and I'm going to write about him. Now, what am I going to write about? I'm going to write about how people are trained. First of all, I want to be able to get in that and know all the movements that are made. I mean, I'm not saying it's ballet, it's related to ballet, but there's something as he moved around on that vehicle with freedom, and a lot of different operations were performed. Sometimes the claw would carry heavy rocks. Sometimes he was moving. There was these iron slats that are on the sidewalk that are covering up, I guess, holes in the sidewalk, and he would, with this claw, with the digits on it, he would move those things from here to there. And he could barely see because he's about, I guess, about 11 feet above the sidewalk, and he has to see through this cab, the glass of the cab. All these things fascinated me. Now, there are hundreds of stories like that. You trip over these stories in this great city. But you have to wait, and I'm going to talk to him. And what am I going to do with it? I don't know. I'm going to find someplace I can write. It's just to be about 1,100, or maybe about 800 words, just a scene. And maybe a little bit about him. He told me, incidentally, that he worked on the World Trade Center in 2001 after, and he'd done stuff. But it's not that he's an exceptional story, but he's one guy that knows his job. And I thought a whole series about people who know their jobs. Do a series of people all over the city. They're not famous. They don't make the newspapers. They don't get on talk shows. But boy, they are really important, knowing their job.
Well, one of the things that you said to me in our interview, and that especially sort of held the attention of these Latin American students I was working with in August, was we talked in sort of the home of magic realism and very open to and sensitive to this kind of thinking. I was quoting you as saying that you're interested in understanding the fictional current that goes beneath the stream of reality, and that it seemed to me that part of what they liked about some of this work, especially something like the beginning of Thy Neighbor's Wife or other things, where you are sort of showing the world as being so intimately connected, these different people, the fact that he's connected to the World Trade Center, the fact that one of my favorite books, The Bridge, which I teach a lot for just this reason, to tell students how, it doesn't have to be an enormous public works project, but there are all sorts of public works projects where there are not celebrities, there aren't press people, right, that you will be rewarded by going there and spending lots of time there. But in addition to that, seeing this kind of the way in which the reality is knitted together, and there's this almost fictional sort of connection, almost surreal connection that people have to each other and to each other into these circumstances. That seems to be very, I mean, aside from the footwork of reporting, that's an important sort of part of your sensibility.
Well, it's all storytelling, and I think that it is, I'm not saying it's essential all the time, because sometimes news doesn't have to be in story form, but I try always to make it that way without distorting anything. All news is made by people. Even what is defined as news is not always clear to me, but there are people alive doing things, and you're all aware of, you see them, and to see them is one thing, but to get that next step is to have a kind of connection with these people. But having the imagination to say there might be a story there. There might be a story there. Anywhere you go, the question, you ask yourself, is there a story there? Is there a story there? And you just find out. Sometimes, I think like most writers, you don't always finish what you start. Can I tell one story?
Sure.
In 1980, I received when I was finishing Thy Neighbor's Wife. In fact, Thy Neighbor's Wife is published. It was 1980-81. I received in New York a letter, which I had to sign for the letter. What do you call it?
A registered.
Registered letter. And this was a man who wrote me from Colorado, from a place called Aurora outside of Denver. And he said, if you're ever out in the Denver area, I think I have a story for you. But I won't tell you until you come to Denver. Well, I think my paperback was out, and I had an opportunity to go there was a tour, a publicity tour that the paperback edition of Thy Neighbor's Wife put me on, and they sent me to California and Chicago. So as I was leaving California, I got the ticket to stop in Denver on the way to Chicago. And I called this guy from California. He gave me his phone number. I said, I'm going to be in Denver. He said, I'll meet you at the airport in Denver. So I went to Denver, and I stood and told him what I was like. I didn't have a red flower on, but he had a description of me. And he was there, and he said, first I want you to sign this. A middle-aged guy. An ordinary guy, could have been a bus driver, just an ordinary working man. And he gave me a piece of paper in which I would sign. I would not write about anything without his permission. I said, well, I don't even know what the story is, but still, I'm not going to show you the story. I'll tell you the story unless you write. Okay, fine, all right. So then he put me in his car, and he drove me to a motel. He said, I own this motel. This is in Aurora. I don't know where the hell Aurora. They never heard of Aurora, but that's where it was. And he said, first I want you to meet my wife. So he took me into the office, and I met the wife. And then he said, now come over here. I'm going to tell you what the story is. So he took me, he said, follow me. He took me to the place in this motel. It was a 2-story motel, and it had slanted roof. Ordinary motel. It could have been a Holiday Inn, but it was just whatever it's called, Aurora Motorhome, I think it was. And he took me to where the people who cleaned the rooms kept the laundry. And he said, we're going to go upstairs. It's a 2-story motel. And he took me upstairs, and then he said, there's also a private ladder that leads to the interior of the roof. So I had to climb this ladder from the 2nd floor of this motel. And then now we're inside the slanted roof, and there was a rug going the length of this motel. There were 20 rooms in this motel. And above each room, there was a mirror, a one-way mirror where you could look into the bedroom, but the person in the bedroom didn't see you. And there also was a microphone, each one. And he said, for the last 25 years, since I bought this motel, he was in his mid-50s, I have been listening to what's been said in here. And I have a record of 25 years, and I have a book. I said, you're a voyeur. She says, yes. But that's just the beginning. He said, I keep records of what people talk about, and I describe what I'm seeing. And I said, what's the point? He said, well, people study they go to laboratories, and I created a laboratory here because I'm interested in human nature that is not aware it's being watched. And I also want to hear what they're saying. So he kept notes. And he said, I'll show you the book after we leave here. I said, but if you ever get caught, no, I know. I said, you're going to go to jail. And I says, I can't write about this because this is a violation of privacy. And he said, well, I just thought you'd be interested. I said, I am interested. And so I went downstairs, and I went into the back office. The wife, incidentally, who booked the people, when people come in looking for a room, she, not all of those, if I said there were 20 rooms, maybe 12 of them had, the other rooms were for people she didn't think was very interesting. So she put her.
He had an editor.
He had an editor. So he showed me this book, volumes of handwriting, everything dated. And I said, well, I can't read all this. I said, I have to go to Chicago. I said, well, I'll tell you what, let me just read a little bit, and then I'll come back some other time, and I can read more. And that's what happened. I read it. It's very interesting. And on another occasion, I then had his phone number, and I'd signed the agreement. And then I went back to Chicago maybe later that year to Denver. And I read the whole thing, and I kept notes. And I actually made a copy of it with his permission. But again, and this was in 1982. I'm going to write that story, and I have the whole, in the guy's life, how he began as a young boy, fascinated by his mother, by his aunt, by his young aunt, by his mother's younger sister, the beautiful woman who used to watch her. He kept records of her, a record keeper. And then he called me about 3 years ago and said, I sold the motel. I said, well, what about all that stuff upstairs? It's still there, but they don't have to. But he said, I want you to, now you can write it. He says, because enough time has lapsed. It's not a violation of privacy. So I think there's a good story here, because I have characters in those rooms, and
This guy look like Anthony Perkins?
No, but I know that does sound like that Hitchcock situation. But it is just a story of many characters and people, and he knows them. Sometimes people he knew were having affairs, and he, of course, and they would mistreat the furniture. Sometimes they'd put cigarettes, and then he'd see his furniture, and he didn't say anything, and he was getting angry. Anyway, I don't know what this is, but this is story stuff, isn't it? It's not something I recommend for journalism classes, but anyway, go ahead.
How to follow that up, I don't know. I know people have questions, people want to make interjections, say things. I don't want us to monopolize
Boy,
things.
we're taking too much. Yeah.
So speak.
Do we have time?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Talk a little about the art of writing profile. Spent a lot of time having the interviews. Can you talk about writing and advice for young writers?
Advice for young writers and about writing?
Writing profile.
Well, I think that all writers and good writers begin by reading good writers. And I was probably 22 or 3 before I started reading good writers. But I read before, but the really good writers that influenced me, I mentioned some of them. And short stories, I just love the short story form. And I think magazine profile writing is like a short story. I think this is it might be in the Paris Review interview, but maybe it's somewhere else. I do remember when I was a sports writer, when I started the New York Times, I went to the sports department first. And the New Yorker published a short story. Or I thought it was a short story. It was actually part of a novel, but I didn't know it. It was by Carson McCullers, and it was called The Jockey. And It was just what I remember was it's about a jockey who had trouble. He was an older jockey and he couldn't make the weight very easily, and he was very angry and about a lot of things. He wasn't winning races was one thing, and he was having trouble with his weight was another thing. And he felt he didn't have a good trainer, and he felt he didn't have good horses, and he was angry. And he comes into the jockey club one day and goes up to the restaurant, hungry as can be. And he sees his trainer, and he sees the owner of the horse, the bad horse that he had been given. And they're back there with all the crowds of people are dining, and they're filling their faces with French fries and steak, and they're munching away, and they're talking in this Carson McCullers story. And then he looks at them, he glares at them, the jockey does, and then he walks over there. And he stands over the table, these two people, and he says something, and they say something, and I forget. And then he walks away, and he's really angry. And one of the trainers says to the owner something like, he described it, that he, the poor guy at his stage in life, and if he eats a lamb chop, you can see the shape of the lamb chop on the side of his ribs. And I thought, that's a detail. I know I said this somewhere, I can't remember what interview. But when I looked for a jockey, to write about a jockey, and I wanted to do as well in my article, my profiles as a newspaper book, as Carson McCullers. I didn't, but it was just that detail that I got from a fiction writer. And some of the great fiction writers, at least people that I most admire and who influence me, are people that do deal with details, specific information. And then there's some contemporary novelists, aside from those here with us tonight. I think of the detail, for example, of Don DeLillo, for example, in his novel Underground, or is it Underworld? Underworld, right? In one part of that, I think, he writes about the parts of a shoe. How many parts are there to a shoe? And this guy goes on and describes more parts to a shoe than I never knew they existed. He has named their names for these parts of a shoe. And there's one thing DeLillo does beautifully. It's like a whole page and a half of the shape and the parts of a shoe. And of course, gloves in Philip Roth's book it's American Pastoral. The gloves, or more recently, in the Philip Roth novel about the grave diggers, there's a scene in a recent novel called Every Man, I believe it is, the detail of a grave digger and how they shovel the dirt and all that stuff. This is journalism at its best. And sometimes journalism at its best is in the hands of the fiction writer. Hemingway's opening scene in A Farewell to Arms, the battlefield, the snowy day in Udine, site of a World War I battle or town. And Pete will probably be able to quote from it, but the description, Hemingway's visual description of that, the soldiers and the blood on the snow, and I remember I did tell Katie, the fiction writer, the short stories I loved most were Fitzgerald stories, and Winter Dreams of this caddy in Minnesota watching a young woman with her very wealthy parents or father teeing off a red golf ball shot into the snow. Detail, pictures. I mean, that can all be captured in nonfiction if you're trained through the art of the great fiction writers for the precision and the picture. What's something, the visual representation. I try in my own nonfiction always to describe the setting.
Many of them gay that you mentioned, Hemingway.
Journalists started.
Dickens, Garcia Marquez.
Oh, journalists.
All newspapers.
That's correct. I should have said that. I'm glad you did. That it's true. That is true. Good.
Other questions as well? Yeah.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that there had never been anyone who you had interviewed who you would see later. And he said that with quite a lot of pride, I think a sense of honor even. And no doubt you say it because you're aware of how much tension there can be sometimes in personal demands or relationship with the subject and the demands of the story. So how do you and did you make that, strike that balance? And you can strike it, or you lucky?
Well, one time, I did write something, and I didn't realize it was offensive. And here's what it was that I wrote. Here's what happened after what I wrote became known. In 1962, 62 or 3, I was assigned by Esquire. It wasn't my idea. Most of what I did for Esquire was not my ideas. I just assignments because I was under contract, and I could sometimes suggest a piece. They let me do it, and sometimes after I got my way, then they'd say, "Okay, now you do this." And one of the editors there, his name is Byron Dobell, and he said, "I want you to." He was the second-ranked editor. The top guy was Harold Hayes, but Byron Dobell said, "I want you to write a profile on the director, Joshua Logan was a theater director. He had big hits in the South Pacific was one Broadway hit that he directed, and Mr. Roberts, and he was a very big-time commercial director, but by the mid-'60s or even early '60s, he had lost his touch. He had a couple failures on Broadway, and he had one opportunity, he thought, and his producer thought, to resurrect this fallen career. And there was a play coming to Broadway in '62 or '63 called Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. It was cast completely by black actors. And it was written by a white man named Peter Feebleman, who was born in the South. I think it was Louisiana. And Joshua Logan was born and reared in Louisiana as well. And Logan had in this cast some very outstanding actors and actresses. One of them was Claudia McNeil, who was a woman of great stature in those days. And there are others in the cast. I won't try to bring that to you, but in the middle of rehearsal, I had permission from him to attend rehearsals, and every day, as this play was being prepared for Broadway, I would be in the audience in the dark, empty theater, and in front of me would be the director, the assistant director, the lighting technician, script people, all the people who are part of the staff of the director, and on the stage were the actors performing. In fact, one of the actors in this play is the great dancer Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey was making an attempt to be an actor, not just a dancer, and this was his attempt to be what Joshua Logan called to be a black Brando. Alvin Ailey never became a black Brando. In fact, he wasn't able to really do well with this role. He really was a dancer. But the point I'm making is that in the middle of one rehearsal, not many days before the dress rehearsal and not many days before the opening of the show, it was 2 or 3 days before the show would open on Broadway, the black actress who played the mother, Claudia McNeil, was a big name in those days, at least among legitimate theater people. She got mad at him, Joshua Logan, correcting a line. And he couldn't get her to do it as he wanted her to do it. And finally he said in exasperation, he walked away from her, he left the stage, he took the steps, and he went back to his usual place, the second row where all they were. He said, "Oh, Claudia, you're acting like some queen. Just some queen up there." And she turned on him, and she said, "You're the queen." There was some question about his sexuality. Joshua Logan was known, and he had a wife, but it was rumored that he was a homosexual, and this was the '60s, and one didn't ever think about admitting that, even if you're part of the theater in those days. And I was here and I saw that, and she said, "You're the queen." And he said, oh, just, and then they had a dialogue, and he got mad, and I had all the dialogue. I took it down, and I had a little light that theater critics have. I could write, and I wrote the whole thing. I had that whole thing. It was a wonderful scene. When it got to Esquire, and Byron Dobell and later Harold Hayes read it, they said, you can't use that. I said, oh, why? He says, well, it's libelous. And he said, you have to get permission. I said, oh, well, okay, I'll try. He said, you have to call him. He has to give you permission to keep that in there. So I called him. And he was very offended. He says, well, you can't use that. So, well, how about, what can I use? Well, just take it out. I said, no, I can't. The whole scene. I said, let me come see you. He lived over in River House. It's very important sometimes not to use the phone if you can see a person. I went over to see him, and I told him how important this story was, no matter what happened to this play. But the story was of a man who did great things, and like all of us, sometimes you reach points in your life that are disappointing to you and to people who are connected to your career. And here is drama within drama. I said, this story shows the director directing a play, but the play having a kind of play within itself, and this scene is part of that. He said, well, you can't use that word. I said, well, we can get a word maybe that fits it. Well, I don't know what that will be. I said, well, Empress? And he said, Empress. Well, let me think about it. I said, well, can I get back tomorrow? He said, no, I'll call you. So later that night he called, and he says, Empress, okay. So I put that in. But it's important to not to have him say, kill it, to go over there and talk. And I had often done that in person. I think it's very important to deal personally with your interviews in person. That's all. Is this, I don't know what the hell the question was that got the Empress in here. But.
Some questions at the back, yeah.
I was wondering if you ever spend time on a story where you were forced to spend a lot of time with someone who had it. Living habits are basically too horrible. Has that ever been communicated and were you ever detrimental?
Well, I don't remember it being detrimental to me, but I remember God, when I did John Bobbitt, the story of the man who lost his penis to his angry wife, a guy that treated her badly and got drunk one night, fell asleep, and woke up with half his penis in her hand as she drove off. I wrote about that in The Writer's Life in great detail. It was supposed to be a New Yorker assignment, but Tina Brown wouldn't publish it. I mean, she turned it down for other reasons, I think, than that. But when I had to be with John Bobbitt, he was, this was after the accident, or it wasn't an accident, after the incident, let's call it that way. He was really a sloppy guy. And when I first went to his apartment, it was in Manassas, Virginia. It was about a week after the incident. And I only knew about this story a week after it happened because the New York Times didn't publish the story. It was published in the Washington Post. And I heard about the story, and I thought I wanted to do it. And Tina Brown gave me an assignment, and I got to go to Manassas, Virginia, and the first person I contacted was the doctor who performed the operation. Bobbitt's penis was reattached in a way, not in a way that made it as good as it used to be, but it nevertheless was hanging together fairly well, but there was a lot of stitching at the time. And the apartment that he lived, which his wife vacated with the half of his penis she took on the night of the incident, he was living with a buddy who came down from Buffalo, and the blood from that, when he was cut, it was 3 o'clock in the morning. He walked out covered with blood and on his hands, and it was dripping, and it was all over the walls of the apartment and the floor and the bathroom, and no one had cleaned it up. When I got there a week later, it was still there. And he didn't move out. The operation had been done that day, and he had 3 days in the hospital, and the fourth or fifth day he went back to the apartment that surely his wife wasn't living in anymore. But he was with his buddy. There's things there, and he had no money. It's not that he could have moved to the Ritz Hotel in Washington and recovered. He had no money. And I was interviewing him in that place. Now, I don't think this is, at least I could describe the place and had him describe to me what it was like to wake up and then realize half your penis wasn't around anymore. And I was very interested in a lot of that story, because the story to me was about, I wanted to write about the white underclass. I wanted to write about Bobbitt, a former Marine, who 2 years after leaving the Marine Corps, he had a hard time finding a job. He was an attractive person, physically attractive. He was stupid as a man, but attractive as a person. But he was undereducated. He had a speech impediment, and he couldn't get a job after he left the military, a job of any consequence. He worked for minimum wage in places like Kentucky Fried Chicken and other franchise places, Olive Garden restaurants. He cleaned up the tables. He had these kind of jobs after being in the Marine Corps, and then he had problems, finances, and he drank too much and beat his wife up too often, and finally she got her comeuppance, and that was the end of his penis. But I'm writing about the underclass and about white trash, the term white trash, that I thought wasn't been written about much. People who are of the underclass, who are minorities, who are black or who are Latino or who are Asian, okay, they have a kind of, but if you're white and blue-eyed and you're dumb and unemployable, except in a minimum wage, after the military gets rid of you, you have an empty life ahead of you. There's not much you can do unless you can change yourself, and too often people are beyond being changed. And he was one of them, Bobbitt. I thought, I want to really write. Some of the great fiction writers deal with this subject. Russell Banks, for example, is a great fiction writer. And very often he'll write about what are subjects that have been in the news. For example, Russell Banks' novel called Darling. The Darling is about Liberia and about the former dictator Charles Taylor. And it's a beautiful novel, but it's so close to what the story of Liberia and Taylor's time there is about, you think you're reading history. But what Russell Banks writes about Trailer Park, one of his novels called Trailer Park, I think. And I thought Bobbitt was out of Trailer Park, and I wanted to do a kind of Russell Banks, or I wanted to do justice to what Banks does in fiction to Bobbitt. And that was part of what I was doing, in addition to describing from the urologist the operation and what it's like to have a banged up penis when you're a man of 25. What's the point? The point is I had to be with this moron for about a month and a half in his apartment most of the time. Later on, I was able to get him out of there and drive him around and take him to dinner. And it was really boring. But I wasn't quoting him. I wasn't quoting him. But there are times, I think, that when writers of nonfiction must be where the story is, where the people who represent the story live, no matter what the environment or the circumstances or the atmosphere of the apartment in this case, or the wretched, petrifying circumstance. You just have to be able to stay the course, as he used the cliche.
You stayed in touch with Bobbitt?
Yeah. Yes, I have. I stay in
What's
touch with
happened?
everybody.
Has he been elected to Congress or something?
No, he works in Las Vegas. He became a truck, he loads trucks. He did some of that, actually, one of those jobs he had after the Marine Corps got rid of him, he did that.
He had a Vegas act for a while, did he?
Oh, he made a porno movie, which there was a porno opportunity he had. He had a porno op.
You
It wasn't.
can't make this country up.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, comment. Yeah, go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard somewhere that you only write a couple of pages a day. Could you other than that?
Why do I only write a couple pages a day? Sometimes I only write a couple pages. Sometimes I write nothing. Why that is, it's kind of the way I write. Now, when I was on a daily newspaper, I would never be satisfied with the first sentence, and that's still true. But even when I was 26 or 5, working for a daily newspaper and having a daily deadline, having a deadline, which was not something you could fool with. As I told Katie, I would write up to the minute, what I was writing was taken from me by the clerk from the desk. But I have I guess I have a belief always that whatever I'm doing isn't good enough. And whatever I'm doing, even if it's good or okay, in my opinion, it could be better. And when I was working on a daily paper, I was always trying to make it better. And I'd spend every minute available to me to redo it, redo it, redo it, redo it. Because I believed that what I was doing, and again I'm lifting information from the Paris Review that I already described, but I thought I'm not writing for a daily newspaper. I'm not writing for the day. I'm writing for a long ago tomorrow. And what I'm doing, and any serious writer, what we're doing, is trying to make on paper live beyond the day. And I took all the time I could to make it as good as time would allow. And when I was able to afford the luxury of time, which is the greatest luxury a writer can have, I took more and more time, and perhaps excessive. I got the work done finally, but because I had this belief that it always can be better, or at least it may not be, by other people's definition, very good to begin with, or very good when it's even published. It was the best I could do, but before I could convince myself it was the best I could do, I wanted to do it again and again and take a lot of time. I never believed, I told you in the beginning of our program today that I take pride in the fact that I could see people after it was published. And the second thing I take pride in is that I never thought I could do it any better. After it was published, I kind of think, well, that's about as good as I could do. That's all the payment I think you need. That's enough. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for staying.